You know, the Apostle Paul once gave his student Timothy this really intense warning about something he called a doctrine of demons. It sounds pretty dramatic, right? Maybe even a little supernatural. But the source material we're digging into today argues it's something else entirely, something way more human. So, what on earth was Paul really trying to warn us about?
And that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The source we're examining here has an answer that might just surprise you. It really reframes this whole ancient warning in a completely different light.
Okay, so here's the verse that kicks this whole thing off. This passage from 1 Timothy, this is our foundation. The source argues that these misleading spirits and teachings of demons aren't exactly what they sound like, and that Paul was pointing to a very, very specific kind of deception. All right, so first things first, how does the source even define this false doctrine? Well, it argues the answer isn't some spooky, supernatural thing. Instead, it's a tradition that was completely crafted by human hands. And here it is, the core reinterpretation. According to this source, the doctrine of demons isn't a teaching from demons at all. Nope. Instead, it's a man-made eschatology, a story about the end times, that's built on a totally false narrative about some big war in the heavens. So this really lays out the two sides of the coin. On one hand, you have the popular story, a war in the heavens, a fallen angel, the whole shebang. But the source we're looking at says, hold on, that's just a human deception. It's actually seen as a form of idolatry because it creates this rival power to the Creator, who the text calls Yahuah, and it distracts from his absolute total authority. So, to counter this whole man-made tradition, the source builds its entire case on one single, powerful concept, the Creator's absolute, undeniable power. The text basically says there's one piece of scriptural evidence that's so powerful, it just completely dismantles the whole war in the heavens story. It's a direct statement about the very nature of creation and power itself. And this is it. This verse from Isaiah is the bedrock for the entire argument. I mean, the declaration is just absolute. A single creator is responsible for everything, light and darkness, peace and evil. From this point of view, there's just no room, no possibility for a rival power or some cosmic war. And the implications of this are huge. I mean, think about it. If the Creator, or Elohim, a term for God used here, is truly sovereign, then no other being can possibly share in that creative power. This means all those stories about powerful angels or demons acting on their own are, by this logic, simply impossible. The Creator's word becomes the one and only standard for everything. So, with that big theological foundation in place, the source then turns to history, arguing that there's a really clear pattern of what happens when people forget about this absolute sovereignty. It's basically a historical warning. The text uses the story of the ancient Israelites as a kind of case study. Their entire history is presented as this big cautionary tale, a perfect parallel for what happens when people turn away from divine commands to follow human-made ideas and idols instead. The source then maps out this whole cycle of rebellion, pulling from the history in 2 Kings. And you can see this clear progression. It starts with abandoning the commands, then moves to making idols, then to worshiping the stars, and finally to serving false gods. But check out that last step. According to the text, they were ultimately given up to this idolatry as a direct result of their own actions. Okay, so if that's the problem, what's the solution? Well, this final section of the text focuses on the path away from all this idolatry and toward what it calls true righteousness. So according to this text, true righteousness isn't about following some external set of rules or philosophies that people came up with. Not at all. It's defined as a deep internal transformation, a real change of the heart and mind that comes directly from the divine power of His Word. And look at that. We come full circle right back to 1 Timothy. The source uses this passage to show that the antidote to the doctrine of demons is right there in the same chapter as the warning itself. The solution is pretty simple. Trust in the living Elohim, the Savior. This is the core teaching that needs to be commanded. To make this path even clearer, the source points to warnings from the book of Colossians. And all these counterfeit paths, they all share a common theme. They're rooted in human ego and speculation. Things like worshiping messengers, arguing about mysteries no one has ever seen, or relying on empty philosophy. And the stakes are laid out pretty clearly here. The false path, the one rooted in human thinking, leads to condemnation and being deprived of the prize. But the true path, the one rooted in divine revelation, leads to acceptance
and something more, a transformation from condemnation into wise counsel.
And that, right there, is the ultimate end goal presented in the text. Following the true path doesn't just change what you believe, it actually transforms your very nature. Human judgment, which we all know can be flawed and condemning, gets remade into wise counsel, something that can genuinely guide others. So this all brings us to a final and pretty challenging question. According to this interpretation, the line between divine truth and man-made tradition can get really blurry. So it kind of asks us to look at our own beliefs and consider what parts are truly from revelation and what parts are just compelling stories we've inherited along the way.